At FIE, we're not just
students
and faculty.
We're not only learners
and lecturers.
We are expanding minds,
Expanding futures.
We're redefining the classroom.
We are life-changing.
eye-opening. We are a community
Driven by our values.
That wants you.
you.
Yes, you.
To join.
Hello, and welcome to In the Field, a podcast from FIE, where we will be exploring all things study abroad. I'm Heidi James Dunbar, writer in residence and faculty, and I will be your host. Joining me today is Dr. Rebecca Pollack. Rebecca's journey in study abroad began as an undergrad, coming to London for the spring of her junior year at Brandeis University. Her internship at the Royal Academy of Arts inspired her to study British art and eventually do a PhD in art history. Rebecca completed a PhD from the City University of New York in February 2022. She studies contemporary British monuments and memorials with a specific focus in Holocaust memorials and British national identity. Rebecca emigrated to the UK in January 2020, and in addition to looking, talking and teaching about art, she enjoys baking, a nice Sunday walk and the theatre. Rebecca is also, of course, the academic faculty director here at FIE. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Heidi. Thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure. So I would love to hear more about how your study abroad experience went on to influence your choices and your decisions in your career and your academics, because it sounds from your bio like it was quite impactful for you.
Yeah, in some ways, really, it was 4 or 5 months that changed the course of my life in a way that I would not have imagined at that time. I went and studied abroad in South Kensington. I lived around the corner from where our students live, which is so fun, on Queensgate, just really around the corner from Foundation House. Gloucester Road was my first London tube station, which always I feel like has some nostalgia to it now that I'm back there again. So I had an internship, not at FIE. I did go to FIE, but the program was similarly structured where we had the first couple of weeks of intense coursework followed by an internship. And mine was 4 days a week. And mine was at the Royal Academy of Arts. I worked on the summer exhibition, which, if you don't know, is the world's largest open call exhibition that's been going on at the RA since 1768, when RA was founded. So really anyone can enter. And what my job was to do was, with a small team of 3 other people, was to sort through every single application. So you get tens of thousands of people who apply to be in the summer exhibition, and you process and sort the application. And while this wasn't ages ago, it was before the process was digital. So we were sorting and filing paper applications. And the internship allowed me to continue through like the beginning of the summer. So I got to do things like meet the Royal Academicians who select the work, right? They do the selection process. And then there's a stage selection where everyone brings in their art and they look at the art in person. So we were filing and sorting all of the endless paintings and drawings and bits that people send in, which is cool because it's from famous artists, but also to like kindergarten or I guess like reception kids. There's a range of artistic background and experience, which is fun to look through. So you organize it and sort it, and then the people who get picked, and then they come and just being in the Royal Academy in general is this kind of like the center of British art in many ways, right? It has this intense history of nationalism and art together, and like what makes British art British was often defined by the Royal Academy. So I really got like a very heavy-handed introduction to British art. And an artist I'd always been really interested in was Rachel White-Read. And while I was in London, I decided to start doing some research for my senior honors thesis that I decided to do on her. And since I was in London, I went to archives and various things. So because I was here. So in some ways, that experience of kind of being at the RA, but also my first experience like writing to archives and just thinking about art in like as a more serious academic, not as just an undergraduate student, kind of overlapped, and they're quite intertwined in my being. And I fell in love with that. I loved the idea of just sitting in an archive and learning about art and like finding a document or like finding a drawing or some correspondence that opened up your eyes about why an artist installed something a certain way or did something a certain way. And I applied to grad school to study contemporary British art. That was sort of what I had wanted to do in America, not here. And then obviously my archive, my dissertation was on a very different topic than what I thought it was going to be. I studied British Holocaust memory, memorials and museums, and like the built environment around Holocaust memory, specifically here. But again, themes about nationalism and Britishness are like integral to what I study and what I think about. So definitely the bits that I picked up from study abroad in that internship really kind of have come to be served as a foundation for how I think. And then I, met my husband while I was doing my research here for 8 months, and now I'm here. So as these things happen. So and study abroad to me was such a, I don't want to say an obvious career choice or something but it was something that when I moved here, I was like, oh, this is something I would really love to look at and doing, because I have the American academic background. I've taught at many American universities throughout graduate school all around New York City. I studied abroad myself. I understand the experience. Yeah. And I wasn't so keen to go into British academia. So I was like, let me look into this. And then COVID happened. So I was a bit delayed, but took me a bit longer to get started. But yeah, that's sort of how my study abroad experience, I guess, kind of in a long answer got me to sort of where I am now.
Yeah. And that's something that I think has come up as a bit of a theme. It's something I was talking to Valeria, how you can start in one place and think, this is what I'm going to do. And then, of course, opportunities open up and new interests. And you think you're going to be going in that direction, studying this, but you discover something extraordinary and go down that rabbit hole. And I think there's something very lovely about being able to be open and following those opportunities and passions. And that's where academia is at its best, when you can do that and explore and play.
Yes. Yeah. And when one door opens you into another one, or you find just sort of like random bits of academia that haven't been unturned, the door's not open, although then you have to convince people to fund you to look at those unopened doors. But, that's a different issue. Absolutely.
I am very jealous of the fact that you've got to hang around and sort of dig about in the Royal Academy and getting all these kind of beautiful submissions. And I'm sure they're very broad and diverse, but how lovely that is too, that people are sort of partaking in and participating in this idea of art making and sending it to someone who's gathering all this stuff. It's pretty incredible. It's a lovely idea.
Yeah, I imagine it's less now that I know that now the submission process is digital. So I wonder how that changes because my memory of working on the summer exhibition is like holding these paper forms that were sent and alphabetizing them. And because you're dealing with tens of thousands, you were alphabetizing them to like the fourth letter in a surname. And you would forget the alphabet by the end because you just didn't know what letter came what, because it was some of the most intense alphabetizing I imagine one can do, which sounds just horribly boring. And also but one of those, like the physicality of those forms and like the Tipex that people use to kind of like rewrite their names, or when they messed up or they'd call you on the phone panicking about something like that is probably gone. So it's just a very different process now.
Yeah. So the materiality, which leads me on to this course you're teaching, and I want to dig into that a little bit. So you're teaching a course on a history of London in 12 buildings, which I want to audit. It sounds brilliant. I'd love to follow you around the city and kind of talk about the city like this. I think it's such an interesting way of thinking about history and how it's represented in materiality. But tell me about the course. Tell me more.
I wanted to introduce an architectural history course at FIE, because I just think London and architecture are two things that just really are that just go together. And when I think of London, and some of my favorite moments and my memories of being in the city are wandering around by myself, sort of aimlessly, maybe between things, maybe after an archive closed and you meeting a friend for dinner and you have like a gap in like a summer evening and you're just wandering around and you have these like layers of buildings around you, looking up, looking around, just, and as a city, London, while it does in some ways gentrifies itself, but it just continuously layers itself. And so almost in most places you go, you get to see kind of like the different layers of the neighborhoods in which you're in, and the different neighborhoods have different characters and different feelings. And yeah, and I wanted to do an architecture history course because I just think you're here, you should, and you can really learn a whole history of a place through its architecture, right? I think that's also what's so powerful about architecture, is that more than even just a painting, is that you can look at one building and you can learn about the social, political, economic, everything that was happening at that moment when the building was built, and further how the building's still used today, right? And like how a building, especially like an older building, how it adapts, right? And how its usage changes through that time and through that context. And that was sort of why I was thinking of like building the course around case studies, because you can look at like, we can look at Tudor England, but pick one house or one Tudor building that's still standing, go look at it, go see it in person. Which would also, I think, from a pedagogical perspective, like reduce some of the influx that you could do in this type of course. It helps you. The instinct sometimes is to overwhelm with images because you just want to like look at all these examples. But the way to teach a visual arts class, at least from my opinion, is to rein in those images. Teach with like 4 or 5 images for a lecture, not 20, right? The less is more, really like hone in and focus on those individual examples. And so that was sort of how the case study idea came to mind, that I was going to pick like these set case studies, one for each week. And then we can spend the first half of the class talking about it, and then the second half of the class going and seeing it, which is like a nice benefit of the 3-hour block.
Oh, I love it. And of course, I think what personally I've always loved about the architecture in any city, but in London in particular, is you can see how the kind of the status quo, if you like, expresses itself and its power in various buildings. But like you say, what London has in particular is there will be social housing, what we might call council housing, cheap by jowl with a millionaire's white stuccoed 4-story next to like it's very mixed up and brought in that sense in terms of design. Now, if you're wandering down Kensington, there'll be very fancy, beautiful houses right next door to social block of flats, shops. It really is that kind of diversity that I think is quite extraordinary in London.
Yeah, and the council flat is a great example of how a building changes over time as well, right? Because we can see a block of flats as clearly council flats, but are all those flats in that block still council flats? Are some of them privately owned? And who's living in that privately owned building? Is that now turning a neighborhood like Kensington into a kind of slightly more complex neighborhood that maybe has more middle class people who can afford the formal council house flat, but might not be able to afford the Georgian terraced house flat, or a flat in a Georgian terraced house? So then thinking about, and so then be able to teach students about, well, actually, what are the various political lenses that you can see this neighborhood through, or this block through? There's this, like, even 2 buildings next to each other, right? There's the romantic, like, Bridgerton narrative that they come to London thinking that they want to explore, which I like to give through a few things. I think it's worth feeding that instinct, but like contextualizing it in a good way for them, as well as then talking about, well, how has a 20th century, how are these buildings still existing today and into the 21st century, right? And what are the politics around that?
Yeah, and as you say, London is layer upon layer. There was no great project. It wasn't like Paris and Haussmann where things were demolished and things. Stuff has been built, so they dig down and go, oh wow, we've just found a Roman burial ground. They're about to build a new train thing, or there was something I read about a while ago now, where they found this layer of carbon where clearly there was but the buildings that had been razed to the ground with fire, and it was, they think, possibly Boudica, the Iceni tribe. Like, it's like a palimpsest. We're scrubbing back, layering on top, layering on top, layering on top. But I think that's quite special too, that there's the London Roman Wall, literally the Roman Wall, next door to the train station, next door to a 1,000-year-old palace, next door to brand spanking new financial buildings within a 20-meter walk kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and Christopher Wren tried hard to get a nice, he was using Rome as an example, as opposed to well, obviously Haussmann is 19th century and Christopher Wren is 17th century after the Great Fire, right? I mean, he built lots of things in London and the churches and various bits like that. But to have he had a plan for London to redo the whole city of London map to be this kind of Roman built city, which would probably, to people who are listening, look more like DC today than it would the way London is, right? With central, with various roads meeting in central points, with monuments, and having wide boulevards on things, which is what Paris actually did do in the 17th century with the Rue de Rivoli and various things like that then Haussmann was able to build upon, right? There was already a beginning to undo that medieval structure of Paris. But the powers that be in London were not into Christopher Wren's map of the city. So we just have it in drawing.
So can you tell me about some of the buildings that you do talk about? Which of the buildings are in your case studies? And do you have a favorite?
Well, some of the case studies I picked were a bit of a balance of thinking about also where students not going, what are they not seeing? So there was a bit of that, and also what is a good specific case study to think about this period of architectural history, or this period of British London history, because actually in many ways I shaped the course thinking about the history of the city of London and breaking it down into architectural periods. So what building can we look at to learn about the history of the city, right? So in some ways it is in a history class, it is being told through the buildings are telling us a history of the city itself. So Regent Street, for example, is such an interesting urban planning or architectural space to think about how the city developed and what was happening and the changing powers of the monarch and the way they were thinking about kind of the empire and the monarch in this different ceremonial realm, right? So John Nash built Regent Street around the same time when the royal parks were becoming kind of codified and park-like, as opposed to, Hyde Park originally was a hunting ground, right, for Henry VIII, and then over time was evolved. And Regent's Park also was built at a similar time, and sort of the land was designed and curated into the vision of the parks that we have now. And so the idea was, well, we need a parade route essentially from Buckingham Palace to Regent's Park, right, to connect the city, to have these routes that go through. And that's where you have Regent Street, this kind of very wide, massive road that separates Mayfair and Soho. And what's even cool is you can see the divide on sides of Regent Street, which I like. If you look at a map of London, you have kind of Mayfair with its squares and its kind of wider streets and more organized layout plan, which is where the wealthy lived. And on the other side of Regent Street, you have Soho. And when you look at the map, the squares are not necessarily perfectly square or rectangular, right? There's a bit more of that medieval city feel, right? And that reflects the poverty of the people who lived in Soho, right? And the level of care that went into city planning on that side. And it's little nuggets like that can really tell a really broad story and really paint a really full picture. And I think in a way that maybe most undergrads aren't thinking about history or this world in which they inhabit and where they walk around, right? And that's quite important to me, right? To hopefully you could take a course in architectural history, and obviously this is a very lofty goal, but to make students just a bit more socially engaged, socially aware of their surroundings, where their feet are going, right? Especially as we travel. And I think that is a thing that our courses don't always talk about so much, right? That these students come here to travel. They're coming here to kind of be tourists. And how can they be more ethical tourists, right? We think about that sustainably, but also it's important to think about that as humans and the way we view the world, not just about, our carbon footprint is obviously very important, but to just be what can I observe and know about a place from as I'm sort of temporarily inhabiting it and walking through it.
Yeah, as opposed to kind of the grand tour, which, is a colonialist paradigm. So we want them to actually not be looking at it as this kind of tourist or that the city or the people in it are these subjects that they are studying, but they are part of it. They are embedded in it and partaking in this cultural exchange and kind of, it's a dialogue rather than an observation.
Yeah, or even just have them understand the colonial elements of this history, which they don't, right? I think that a lot of the architecture, the examples I use we do connect to empire and power structures that might not necessarily be empire, depending on the period of time that we're talking about. Because some is pre-empire, some is well, very little is post-empire, but post-empire in a technical sense, the empire still lives on in the city. In the city, it definitely does. So, but yeah, to like have them think about the power structures at play, right, and the dynamics of that, and like how you exist in these cities and different power structures have built them or contained them. Something really cool about London, though, and I think I do want to highlight in the course, is that, and especially in the city, as this like, because the 1 mile of the city is actually quite a good place to even zoom in and do focus on in a lot of ways, because it just has everything, is that you have these moments in London where the city was destroyed and rebuilt, right? Primarily the fire in 1666 and the Blitz, right? And to see kind of the manifestations of destruction and rebirth of the city is quite cool. I think it's something special about London that we can talk about. And that's still ingrained in society today. As someone who's not from here, the fire safety things are hilarious in the sense of like, not hilarious in that fire safety is serious, but in the way that you'll talk to someone and that like, they will talk about the fire of 1666 like it was yesterday. Like we need to, and just the level of fire safety as kind of part of the culture is so different from an American perspective, right? Like I grew up with fire drills, but it just seeps into society, like the way that the fire has shaped the way people think about building and just, your furniture, right? You can't have a furnished apartment without its fire tags on it if you're a landlord. That's not necessarily a rule in other societies, right? This idea of fire safety as this at the forefront.
Tell me about like one building that you do talk about in the course that is a specific time frame. Like give me a little cheeky insight. If I were to come and audit the class, what would I be looking at?
Okay, so this is also one of my favorite buildings in the history of London, I would say. So I think the Bank of England is like this excellent example about why of just all of these sorts of things we've been talking about. Okay, so yeah, the bank was founded in 1694, right, by British merchants, because England was actually one of the few countries that didn't have a national bank at that time. Within Europe, I should say, was one of the few European countries that didn't have a national bank. And it's chartered by Parliament to lend money to the government. That's sort of why the bank was founded. In 1776, this guy, Adam Smith, he wrote that basically the stability of the Bank of England is equal to the stability of, right, the British government. Like that's, the bank was in some ways the country, right? Because what did the bank do, right? It wasn't just a bank. It created this network that middle class, and I say middle class with a credit salt to what we think of today as middle class individuals, but middle class 18th century individuals, i.e. incredibly wealthy people who just weren't aristocrats, were able to kind of generate wealth through the empire, right? And through international trade. I always like to look at the bank as this kind of as the center of the empire, right? It was where the money was. They created the money, they generated the money, they created the economy that allowed all of these private institutions to go out to the rest of the world and conquer it or set up other institutions there and de facto conquered it, right? I think that is sort of in some ways one of the best misconceptions about how the empire worked, right? That it wasn't that like the British went out and just like gunned people down. I mean, they did in many places. I'm not saying they didn't do that, but like in the initial conquering phase, right? It was about setting up institutions. In my PhD, I wrote a lot about botanic gardens, right? And how botanic gardens were this like source of this too, but right, using science, using industry, merchandise, right? In Canton, China, the British Empire was there as a trading port, right? And a very important outpost of the empire, right? So trade and money essentially were central to the imperial project. And so that's the bank, right? So when we think of the Bank of England, especially the historic bank, we really have to think about, okay, well, this is the center of the empire. While the crown is in many ways, actually this building is what allowed the British Empire to thrive and like succeed. And specifically John Soane's building, which is when we think of the bank, I think that is just the architectural image that anyone should have in their mind. I wish I could, it's a audio format, but just go Google John Soane's Bank of England so you can get a sense of what it is. And the bank, that it was built in 1780 and demolished for the most part in 1920. But the bank that is there now still retains most of the qualities that Johnstone's building had in some ways, at least externally, right? So if you walk down Three Needle Street, which if you're listening to this, go if you haven't been to the bank or paid attention to the building when you exit the station, right? You're met with this like fortress. And the reason that there are no windows on the outside of the bank for security and safety reasons, but historic security and safety reasons. As we all know, banks today have windows, but banks in the 18th century couldn't have windows for security. So, but there are still no windows on the famous facade of the bank. But Johnstone used a very specific architectural language, right? What we call as historicism, meaning he looked at various historic architectural forms and sort of adapted them and used them to create a new form of architecture to represent this new modern England, right? To represent this national ideal of what he was building, right? So this is nationalism is ingrained into the style of architecture, right? He's looking towards Rome. He's looking towards different bits of English architecture and other different bits of other European architecture, mostly Rome. We often see Rome being used around in the early imperial expansion as a way of asserting England as the next Rome, right? Using Roman style architecture is a symbolism of we are the next, like the child of Rome, right? We are the next Roman Empire. And that's not new, right? That's what Christopher Wren wanted to do by using the Roman map, using Rome as an inspiration for the city map, right? This idea that Rome is, it like validates us or as a nation, right? If you will. And the building that came before, the original building from like the early 18th century, late 17th century, was Neo-Palladian. So it was actually much more, it was a classic Renaissance building. And Soanes on top takes that and kind of like expands he builds this big rotunda and these kind of walls and uses, he structured the bank to kind of use light and shadow as well as form and ornaments, if you will. I guess that's like a lot of jargon, but basically to create this emotional character of the building. And he wasn't bound by like the strictures of what we think about with style and architecture. It's not a neoclassical building. It wasn't neoclassical. He wasn't sticking to the classic things. And he also wasn't sticking to the traditional British picturesque era architecture that was going on maybe in country homes and things like that. He was willing to kind of make this synthesis that's in the service of reading the building in this new way, because it was doing this new thing, right? It was building this empire. And it was also at this time in the 1780s, I think also while he's making this new synthesis of architecture, where a lot was happening in Britain at the time, right? 1780, there's the American Revolution, the French Revolution. There was just in general a shortage of cash. So money printing was changing at that time as well. Small denominations were beginning to evolve. It's the moment when we're not having gold and silver backing money. So also banking is changing. There's grain shortages that continue into the 19th century, and things that the empire is looking to solve, right? To kind of fix some of these problems, right? And so he's sort of creating this new style of architecture at this time when England sort of needed something new to represent itself, if that makes sense. And again, it's a bank. So I don't know if the average person today thinks that, I mean, we know that banks are obviously ingrained in lots of power structures. I'm not saying that's new, but again, to think about this as like the center of the empire and not like the British Navy, right? I think is a really powerful and interesting tool to teach with, right? To teach students, okay, well, empire isn't just about war and peace, right? It's power in this instance is through wealth. And I think also science, again, as I mentioned before, was the other massive arm involved here. And the Enlightenment and how the Enlightenment can be, we think of it as all positive, but actually these are enlightened ideas that were used to kind of colonize and instill a white supremacy, sort of globally. So to kind of complicate all of these issues, I think the bank is a really good example of this. I could keep going on, but I will stop.
I love that. Thank you. Because I didn't know that hadn't ever thought about that building in those terms. Like you say, it's one of those things, whether you're a student or someone who's lived here all their life, you just walk past it without even thinking about those nuances. So I really appreciate that. Do you have a city secret that you are willing to share, that you're happy for us to, maybe stick our noses into?
Well, I don't know about city secrets, but because in general, I do feel like sometimes the path well trodden is well trodden for a reason, And the place I take my students to as many classes as I can is Kenwood House, I would say, up at Hampstead Heath, which isn't a secret, but it's a bit out of the way and is a bit not on most people's radars in many ways. And it's, again, you have to get to Hampstead and you have to get to the Heath, which is also just a reward in itself. But it's free to go to 7 days a week. It was the house owned by Lord Mansfield, the Chief Lord Justice, who was most famous for his decision on the Zong case, right? The case that when there was this a British-owned slave ship coming from, I think it was going from Africa to the Caribbean, where they intentionally threw off their cargo, i.e. they killed, right? They murdered hundreds and hundreds of enslaved Africans because they were worth more dead than alive at that point because of disease that had riddled the ship. And you could only claim insurance on cargo that was killed at sea from like a natural, like from a storm or from as opposed to illness, right? So the Zong ship, they murdered all these people and claimed insurance. Now, Lord Mansfield was able to find the ship owner is guilty of insurance fraud as a result. That was sort of how he got them. But he basically, he's very famous for that decision that that human cargo essentially shouldn't be insurable. That was also sort of part of the decision, which was one of the first steps towards ending the slave trade, not necessarily ending slavery. This story is also very famously encapsulated in Turner's Slave Ship, which you can go see in Boston, the MFA, really powerful painting, right? So that's his house. Not that the house is so much about him. It was later owned by the Guinness family, famously of Guinness beer, and then it was donated to English Heritage on the Country after Ivor Guinness died. And the collection of art is amazing. Also, I guess students would probably know it from Notting Hill, where Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant are having a little chat on that like beautiful slope that leads off of Kenwood. But yeah, I think that most people who come to London, especially if you're a tourist, really would skip over it. But it's a free activity. So beautiful, such a well-kept house also. And they have just also an excellent cafe. And then you get rewarded with like a bit of the Heath as well. I love taking students there. It's also a way for me to you can imagine I have good views on the English country house. I really, I love going to a country house. I love seeing the architecture, but also really love kind of delving into the histories of nationalism that is embedded into the country house and the garden architecture surrounding it. And to really kind of teach students about that and kind of the power structures of the English country house and how it was the place that people innovated and thought about different things. But yeah, I think that's always a good place to go.
What I'm loving and that I'm getting from you is if you just peel some of the layers back in these things, it's very easy, these buildings, this sort of space, it's so easy to sort of take for granted that you're moving around and you're getting to work and you're getting to studies and you're going to meet people. If you just peel back a couple of layers, you'll be rewarded with so much history that's kind of redolent and vibrating under the surface. So I love that. Thank you so much. That was just brilliant. Thanks for joining me. I loved talking to you. That was brilliant.
Thank you so much. Yes, this was so fun to talk to you too.
Thank you for listening. We really hope you enjoyed our podcast. FIE provides life-changing study abroad experiences in the UK, Ireland and Spain. As a non-profit educational organisation, we are passionately invested in making a difference for our students as the future global leaders of tomorrow and the field of international education as a whole. The FIE podcast is a creative and academic space exploring everything, the people, the places and opportunities that make your experience so valuable and exciting.
FIE, we're here to help you
Unlock a wider
brighter future.